Hey developers, it is good to be back. I think I've mentioned in earlier videos, I've been doing a master's in software development program at Boston University and have not had much time this year to make any of these videos. I don't have any classes for the rest of 2021. My son calls it my off season. So I thought I would take this time to make a few more videos. And today's a little different, I guess, than the normal theme of this channel, which has really been around more of not really, I'm always going to say like Salesforce specific development, but kind of larger, software engineering concepts and how we apply them to Salesforce. And today we're going to take a stop and we're going to do really just a fundamental feature of the Apex programming language, Queueable Apex, part of running asynchronous Apex. And this is going to follow on, I think, some other videos where we're going to use this. But I also just think it's really an essential. If you are a developer on the Salesforce platform, you must know how to use Queueable Apex and you must know how to use batchable Apex, period. Queueable used to confuse me when I was starting off, and it really shouldn't have. There's nothing hard about it. There's nothing right? I mean, it's pretty straightforward. I think I just didn't really understand object-oriented programming, and the languages, or not languages, the examples in Trailhead use some real OO basics, and that tripped me up a little bit. So we're just going to kind of work through that. We're going to make the most simple, contrived, queuable class that we can. We're going to run some tests on it. And then we'll revisit it in a week or so, see if we can make it a little bit better. So with that, let's get into the code, right? All right. So I am opening up IntelliJ with Illuminated Cloud. And before I do that, I wanted to just visit Trailhead real quick and talk about Queueable Apex before we get into the code. So Queueable versus future. I'm going to say if you're learning the platform, in my opinion, there's absolutely no reason to be writing a future method in 2021. So, I mean, you should know how they work because you're going to see them in legacy code bases. But if you were doing anything new, I don't know. I haven't written a future method in years. Queuables have their own syntax, and the important thing is, implements Queueable. And that's just an interface. It's all it is. There's nothing really special about a class, right? If you're not sure about interfaces, I have a video, come back and I'll put a link to it and it'll show up somewhere up there, of where you can go and learn a little more about interfaces if you're not sure how they work, because it's an important part. So you just have to have implements Queueable. And anytime we use an interface, right, and implements is the keyword for an interface, there's going to be one or more methods that we must provide an execution context for, right? That's how it works. So here we have this. I mean, this is right. They're going to update a parent account. And I just want to go this is just a normal class, right? Except for it has implements Queueable. And it's got a couple member variables. Takes them in through the constructor. This.accounts, this.id. I think this threw me off. I'm just going to call this out on Trailhead. I feel like this is kind of a weird practice here, right? Typically, if you have a member variable named accounts, the name of your property is also accounts, right? So it'll be, this.accounts equals accounts, etc. And I would have said this.parent ID equals, parent ID, right? So if you're learning Trailhead, or maybe Trailhead team, this confused the heck out of me when I was starting off. All right, then we have our execute method. So if we are implementing Queueable, we must have an execute method. And again, what I want to call it, we're using objects, we're using classes, so you have to have this method, but you don't actually have to have any of your real business logic in there. It can just call a method, it can, instantiate another class and do whatever you want. But you do have to have the execute method. Queueable context, and that's something Salesforce uses, under the hood as part of the implementation of the Queueable interface. So the other thing I want to know is, why do we use Queueable? And is essentially Queueable is going to give you a little bit more generous governor limits, right? I'm going to say, I think, you get 200 SQL queries, and you get a much larger, I think CPU time. But we can Google that. You can go read the docs. That said, I can't think of any Apex transaction I would ever write that needed 200 SQL queries. That would be crazy. What I really think where where Queueable Apex shines, and where I really recommend it, is when you are updating related records. So save those governor limits, save those 100 queries, save your CPU, save your heap size for the things that really have to happen right now. So I'll give an example. Maybe if I was updating a campaign to go kind of maybe down the Salesforce product stack, I'm updating a campaign member, right? And somehow when I update that campaign member, I also want their related lead or contact record to be updated. The odds are the user doesn't need that feedback right away. So that would be a great example of let's do that asynchronously. And typically asynchronous, especially Queueable Apex, still happens very, very quickly. I think because today we're going to do it with a Scratch org and a developer edition, so it's going to run a little bit more slowly. But really what you're doing is you're telling Salesforce, hey, in exchange for you running this, can run these Salesforce servers, we have the capacity to do this, you give me some bigger governor limits. That's really all it is. And so again, I really highly recommend anytime you are updating related records or anything where the user doesn't need kind of instant real-time feedback, I really recommend that goes through the asynchronous, through the Queueable route, and you save those governor limits, husband them for the things in that transaction that really do have to happen in real time. And especially, if you have you're the lucky developer, you've got this greenfield implementation. It maybe seems at times like you can be kind of careless with your queries and things like that. But 10 years, as you build and this becomes a major enterprise, you'll start to run into issues. So I think that's really, I would say, start implementing, looking for where your code can be run asynchronously as early as possible. So that said, let's open up IntelliJ, Illuminated Cloud, and let's take a look at how we would write some Queueable Apex. And all right, so we need to create a class. New Apex class, and we're going to call this, imaginatively enough, Account Updater. And yes, we're just going to add that to Git. And while we're doing this, we're going to create a test class because I wanted to show you how we test. And we want a unit test, and we're going to say this is our Account Updater test class. All right, looks good. Okay, so let's go back to our actual production code. And again, this is a contrived example. And there are going to be code smells throughout. And we'll talk about them a little bit along the way. And I'm hoping in the next couple videos we can kind of show how we can refactor and use some other patterns to make those a little bit better. But so we have our account updater, and we said we want this to be asynchronous Apex, right? So the first thing it needs to do is it needs to implements Queueable. All right. Now, Illuminated Cloud is throwing that helpful red squiggly at me saying there's a problem because now that I have implemented an interface, I have to implement the execute method. So I'm just going to let IntelliJ do that for me. And I'm going to go over here and just clean this up a little bit. Queueable context. And I'm just going to call that, change that to QC because that's what I like to do. Okay, so for right now, let's just say our account has a member variable of an account ID. All right, so let's just say, we're going to say, private ID, account ID. Okay. Now let's create our constructor. And if you remember from our earlier videos, and I do have one about just basic, how do we do a constructor? A constructor is just a set of instructions for how do we initially set up this object the very first time. It's a special method that always has the name of the class of the object. So we're going to say public account updater, and then we're going to say this dot account ID equals account ID. Perfect. Okay. And that's all we're going to do in our constructor. Our class is going to take in, our object is going to take in an account ID. Now we've got in our Queueable context method, I actually don't like to have any business logic really in the execute class. So what we're going to say is update account. All right. And got a red message there because there is no, we're going to do enter, void update account. There we go. Okay. So now we're going to create our update account method. So the first thing we really need to do is we need to get an account to update. So we have that ID up there. So let's say account equals select ID times, okay, so I just want to call out this real quick. This is a custom field that I added before this video to demonstrate this trivial and contrived example. So when we run this, it's just going to increment the number just to prove that this is working asynchronously. So if you want to follow along, you'll need to add that custom field in on the account object in your own developer edition. All right, where ID equal, we're going to just say this dot account ID. Select ID. Oh, because I don't need that last comma there. I'm getting some equals. Oh, how about from, right? It might be nice if I actually tell Salesforce what object I want from account. There, now let's fix that up a little bit. Okay, so now we've queried our account. And this, I'm just going to say, this to me is the first code smell. Inline SQL like this can end up being very, very difficult to maintain because now I cannot test this method without also interacting with the data layer. And we'll get into that probably in future videos. How do we make this a little bit better? Okay, but we have our account. And for today, we're going to keep this as simple as possible. And then we're going to say account dot times updated by asynchronous apex plus equals 1. And then we actually are going to have to do some DML, right? So update account. Next code smell here is, again, and these should all be handled by not in the same method, because now we cannot test this method without testing all of these other things. We have to query the data layer, and then we have to update the data layer. So in future videos, we'll talk about how we can solve this with composition, right? And we're going to have different classes that we will access that will handle our SQL, that will handle our DML. If you're curious, I'll provide a link to it. I think James Simone and his blog, The Joys of Apex, does a really amazing job of writing about these issues and providing fantastic solutions that I use at work, I use in production all the time. All right, but this should do it. This should update our account. So let's just take a look at the code. What do we have going on? We have our account updater, takes an account ID, gets that in the constructor, this.account ID equals account ID, implements the execute method, execute calls update contact, which is going to get us our account, update our account, or increment this field, right? And then update the account. All right, so let's push this up to our scratch org. Why did our push fail? Unrecognized symbol, which is not a valid Apex identifier. Account updater test. Oh, somehow I got that in there, huh? Don't know how I did that. All right, let's try again. The joys of live programming. Okay, we've got everything pushed up. Let's close out our terminal. And let's open up, boom, what do we want to use? Anonymous Apex. And I have already set this up. I ran a couple tests earlier. So if we want to run Anonymous Apex, this is how it happens, right? Is system. So we created our account updater class. I passed it the ID of an account that's in my Scratch org. And I'm going to run system.enqueueJob account updater. Salesforce is then going to take care of the rest of it for me, right? It's going to call the account updater class from a Queueable context. It's going to say, you know what, because you implemented this interface, we know that you have to have an execute method. So let's look at that execute method and let's run it. All right, that's all that's really going to go on here. So let's I need to, you know what, I really need to make a hotkey someday for Anonymous Apex for these videos. And let's run it. Okay. And what we want to do, let's go to our dev org and let's go to our Spacely Sprockets, the account I made it. Okay. And so that worked. That updated it. And let me reset that to 0 because I don't think I actually showed. Let's do this again. Let's set it to 0. And let's open up. Let's run that one more time. All right. And it should be just that fast. So now let's refresh this. And if we still have a 0 there, we'll go check the jobs. Okay, that ran, and you see, I mean, it was that fast, right? It updated before we had a chance to. But what you want to do, if you're new to this, is you also have your Apex jobs queue. All right? And that's where you can see all of your queuable, your batchables, etc., your async Apex running. So I can see there, hey, I called it, it ran, and you can see here some failures when I was kind of doing the demo. And if it makes you feel better as a developer, like I really screwed up the first time through, even doing such a contrived example as this. So there you go. You could see all my failed attempts the first time before I walked through this. All right, so that's all we have to do to write a very simple asynchronous queuable Apex class. Last, not least, is let's talk about how do we test this thing. All right, so first, you know what, we're just going to do a test setup method. So first we're going to do test setup. Test setup. All right, we're going to do a full-blown kind of integration test and test to make sure everything's working. Static void it should update account. All right. Oh, no, because that's wrong. This is our setup. So I always just call my setup methods setup. All right, we're just going to say account equals new account name equals test ACC. All right. Oh. Looks like somehow they wanted to give me an email in there, but we're just going to do, and then we're just going to do insert account. All right. Now let's create our actual test method. At is test static void it should update account. And we are going to say account to update equals, we're going to have to query the database, select ID from account. We're going to just say, there should only be one, right, because we'll run it in the test context, but I always like to add that limit in there. It makes me feel a little better. All right, so we've got account. We've got our account. Now, when we want, anytime you want to test any type of asynchronous Apex, it needs to be wrapped in a test.start, test.stop method. And I really recommend that as a best practice, no matter what, even if you're not testing asynchronous. We've got to start before we stop. Test.start. Couple reasons. I mean, it gives you a fresh set of governor limits for your tests. What I really like is it's just, to me, it's a visual indicator of this is the piece that I'm really testing. And if you're running asynchronous Apex, it's saying, hey, this test has got to wait until the asynchronous context has completed. If I don't have this, the test is not going to wait for our asynchronous class to finish its run. So then we need account. We're just going to say account updater equals new and we're going to pass it in account to update dot ID. Then we're going to do test dot stop. Test. Oh, and that's test dot start. You're wondering why, I'm trying out a new extension, tab 9, that sometimes is almost too helpful with its code completion, and but so far I really like it. Discovered it from one of Kevin Poorman's videos on the Salesforce developer channel, and then we should have let's have our assertion. 1. Actually, we'll do it this way. We'll do account. To do that, I'm sorry, I'm not used to writing some of these big integration tests. We're going to have to query it from the database again, aren't we? Account updated account equals. All right. Select ID. Time data from asynchronous Apex. From account limit 1. All right, now let's do our assertion. We're going to say updated times equals Apex equals 1. And we're going to do should increment account. Oh, didn't need our underscore C there. All right, now let's go back and let's try to push our unit test up to our scratch work. Okay, great. So now let's run our unit test and see what we get. Let's see if it passes. Moment of truth. It failed. What did we do wrong? Failed the assertion. So why would it fail the assertion? We know it works in real life. Let's look at our coverage. Yeah, how about that? It will not run. Listen, here's your pro tip. Your Queueable class will not run if you don't enqueue your Queueable class. Okay? So, let's, if we can't laugh at ourselves, what can we laugh at, right? Let's do system.enqueue job updater. All right, let's push that again. Let's try our test again. It's going to be embarrassing if it doesn't work this time. There we go. Our test passed. All right. So, yeah, that's really important too. Besides putting your Queueable Apex inside a test.start, test.stop, you must actually invoke the queuable part of it with system.queuejob. So that's it. That is asynchronous Apex. Nothing hard about it, but an absolutely essential skill. And again, I think anytime you're looking, especially updating related records, things the user does not need, I'm going to update an opportunity. And when I do that, I want to update the opportunity owner to reflect something, etc. Highly recommend look at asynchronous routes to manage that code. For the long-term health of your org, I believe you'll be glad you did. So hope this is helpful. If it was, please drop me a like, drop me a comment in the notes below. And I'll see you in the next one. Take care, everybody.